I inherited $75 million and the biggest mansion in Beverly Hills. I didn't even wait for my wife's ashes to cool before kicking the old man out. Judge me all you want, but when you're at the top, you don't share your legacy, especially with someone clinging to a spot they never earned, someone who thinks grief gives them permanent residence rights. I did what needed to be done, and around here, wealth, family, and reputation aren't protected by soft feelings. They're protected by decisive action. Arthur just stood there at the lawyer's office door, looking like he couldn't decide if I was serious or completely insane. In the world of real money, anyone who hesitates loses ground fast, and I've never been the hesitating type. I played it straight, told him it wasn't hate or cruelty. It was pure business logic. The will was crystal clear. Stella trusted me to keep her empire together, not turn our 12,000 square foot estate into some kind of morbid shrine where her father could shuffle around, touching her things, living in the past like some broken ghost. You know what happened next? My social stock only went up. I became the headline at every dinner party from Rodeo Drive to Mulholland. People wanted in on my next move, congratulated me for finally cleaning up the legacy mess. Out here, Beverly Hills only respects the guy who draws a hard line and actually stands by it, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the bleeding hearts. I announced a complete architectural remodel, wiped the place clean of the past, replaced family photos with modern art, auctioned off that old Steinway piano for charity, great press coverage, perfect for building the new brand. Tell me, if you were on top, taking it all, would you do differently? Or put someone else first? Drop your take below. And subscribe. This is one story you won't forget. Getting stuck in nostalgia isn't my style. Never has been. If you're living for yesterday, collecting dust with old memories, you don't deserve a piece of tomorrow. Not here. Not in the priciest zip code in California where every decision counts. I made sure Arthur left with a substantial check. Generous, honestly, considering he had no legal claim to anything. Even set him up with a nice place far away from Bel Air and even further away from me, far from the life Stella and I built together. Regrets? None whatsoever. Every move was calculated, like always, like everything I've ever done in business and life. Destiny favors whoever keeps emotion completely out of the equation, and I've mastered that art form. Looking at everything I've built, every asset I've secured, every connection I've made, I can say with complete confidence that no heir has ever guarded his legacy better than I did. Funny thing about reaching the top, though the nights get quieter than you'd expect. Is it jealousy echoing from the old crowd? Or the past knocking at the door? Or maybe it's just what happens when you're the only one willing to do whatever it takes to win. The renovations started the next week, and I threw myself into every detail with the same precision I'd used to build my investment portfolio. Watching those workers tear down Arthur's old study, ripping out the dark wood paneling he'd helped Stella install years ago, felt like watching a surgeon remove infected tissue. Clean, necessary, final. I hired the best interior designer in West Hollywood, someone who understood that mourning periods are for people without vision, without the backbone to move forward. We replaced everything that whispered of the past with sleek surfaces, contemporary art, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The house wasn't just being remodeled, it was being reborn as a monument to success, not sentiment. My phone buzzed constantly with invitations, congratulations, business opportunities. Everyone wanted to associate with the man who'd had the courage to make hard decisions when it mattered. At the Beverly Hills Country Club, partners who'd barely acknowledged me before were suddenly interested in my investment strategies, my future plans, my perspective on building generational wealth. The bank called to confirm the transfer of assets, all $75 million flowing smoothly into my accounts like water finding its natural level. Stella's financial advisor, a sharp woman named Patricia, complimented me on handling the transition with such professional detachment. She said most widowers let emotion cloud their judgment for months, making costly mistakes while drowning in nostalgia. But I understood something they didn't, something Arthur never grasped during all those years he lived in our house like an honored guest. Money respects strength, not sentimentality. Legacy belongs to whoever has the vision to protect it, not to whoever cries the loudest about blood relations and family history. The press coverage was exactly what I'd hoped for. A tasteful profile in Beverly Hills magazine about my charitable auction, my plans to modernize Stella's foundation, my commitment to turning grief into positive action. The journalist wrote about my remarkable resilience and business acumen during personal tragedy. 3 weeks after Arthur's departure, I hosted my first dinner party in the completely renovated dining room. 20 of the city's most influential people, eating on china that cost more than Arthur's monthly pension, drinking wine from my carefully curated cellar. No one asked where the old man had gone, and I certainly didn't volunteer the information. Success has its own gravitational pull, and I was finally feeling the full force of mine. The first sign something might be wrong came during what should have been my moment of triumph. I was at Marcus Whitfield's annual charity gala, the kind of event where Beverly Hills elite gather to see and be seen, to write checks that buy social currency as much as good karma. I'd just written a substantial donation to the Children's Hospital Fund, making sure the check was visible when the photographer captured the moment. That's when I noticed Harper Castillo watching me from across the room, her expression unreadable behind her designer glasses. Harper had been Stella's lawyer before becoming mine, and she knew every detail of our financial empire. She approached with the careful precision of someone delivering news that needed to be heard, but wouldn't be welcomed. She told me there were some procedural delays with the estate. Nothing unusual for an inheritance of this magnitude, but certain assets would need additional verification before full transfer could be completed. Standard bureaucratic nonsense, she assured me, but it would take a few more weeks to resolve. I brushed off her concerns with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem money couldn't solve. Delays happened, especially with complex estates, especially when government agencies moved at their typical glacial pace. I had more than enough liquid assets to maintain my lifestyle while the paperwork crawled through its predictable channels. But over the following days, small irritations began accumulating like grains of sand in expensive machinery. The contractor working on the master suite renovation mentioned payment delays. Nothing serious, just asking when the next installment would arrive. My platinum card was declined at an exclusive restaurant, which the manager quickly blamed on a processing error, though his apologetic smile carried a hint of something else. The art dealer who'd been helping me acquire pieces for the new collection called to ask about the timeline for our pending transactions. 3 different vendors, all suddenly concerned about payment schedules that had never been questioned before. I told myself these were temporary glitches, the kind of minor complications that resolve themselves once lawyers finish their paperwork marathons. But there was something in Harper's voice during our phone conversations, a careful neutrality that hadn't been there before, like she was choosing her words with unusual precision. The social invitations kept coming. The dinner parties continued. The country club members still sought my opinion on market trends and investment strategies. But I noticed subtle shifts, conversations that died when I approached certain groups, glances exchanged when people thought I wasn't watching. Nothing dramatic, nothing I couldn't rationalize away, just small cracks appearing in what had been a perfectly smooth surface. Harper's call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing architectural plans for the pool house renovation, my coffee growing cold as I studied blueprints for what would become the crown jewel of the estate's transformation. Her voice carried that lawyer's tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, professional but weighted with implications she wasn't ready to spell out directly. She needed to see me immediately, she said, not tomorrow, not later in the week, but today, within the hour if possible. There had been developments regarding the estate that required immediate attention and couldn't be discussed over the phone. The urgency in her carefully controlled voice sent something cold sliding down my spine, but I maintained the confident tone that had carried me through every business crisis I'd ever faced. I drove to her downtown office in my Porsche, the same route I'd taken dozens of times for meetings about investments, acquisitions, the routine legal maintenance that comes with serious wealth. But this time the familiar buildings seemed sharper, the traffic more aggressive, everything carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Harper's office reflected her success, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city, leather-bound legal volumes arranged with museum precision. She offered coffee, which I declined, then settled behind her massive desk with the manila folder that would change everything. The words came in her measured lawyer's cadence, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum clarity and minimum emotional impact. There had been a clause in Stella's will, a provision I hadn't fully understood during the initial reading, something about fiduciary responsibility and family legacy preservation that now carried legal weight I'd never anticipated. My actions regarding Arthur's removal from the estate had triggered this clause, creating what she called grounds for review of the inheritance terms. The language was complex, deliberately obscure, but the practical effect was beginning to crystallize with terrifying clarity. Certain assets were being frozen pending investigation, not permanently, Harper emphasized. But until the estate could be certain all terms of Stella's wishes were being honored completely. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, even access to some property deeds, all suddenly wrapped in legal restrictions that felt like steel cables tightening around my throat. I demanded explanations, threatened to find new legal representation, insisted this was all some bureaucratic mistake that competent lawyers should be able to resolve within days. But Harper's expression remained professionally sympathetic while revealing nothing, and I realized with growing dread that she knew something I didn't, something she wasn't authorized to share yet. The drive home felt different, longer, like the distance between my office and the house had somehow expanded while I wasn't paying attention. The reality of my situation hit with the brutal efficiency of a financial avalanche, each failed transaction driving me deeper into a pit I hadn't even known existed. My American Express was declined at the gas station where I'd bought premium fuel without thinking about cost for over a decade. The private jet company that had always accommodated my last-minute travel requests suddenly required payment in advance, their apologetic tone carrying the unmistakable message that my credit was no longer golden. Within 48 hours, every major account showed the same terrifying status, frozen pending legal review. My liquid millions transformed into numbers I could see but couldn't touch. The contractors working on the house renovations received notices from their banks that the checks I'd written were being held, payments suspended until further authorization could be obtained. My investment advisor, a man who'd managed my portfolio for 8 years, called with the strained politeness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. All trading activity had been suspended, every asset locked in place like insects trapped in amber. He couldn't explain the legal mechanisms causing this paralysis, only that his hands were completely tied until whatever review process had been triggered reached its conclusion. The Beverly Hills lifestyle I'd embraced with such confidence suddenly revealed its merciless arithmetic. The mortgage on the mansion required monthly payments that dwarfed most people's annual salaries. The staff I'd hired to maintain the estate, the gardeners, housekeepers, and security personnel, all expected compensation that I could no longer provide. The renovation contracts carried penalty clauses for delayed payments that multiplied daily like compound interest working in reverse. For the first time since inheriting Stella's empire, I felt the cold touch of genuine panic. Not the manageable stress of business decisions, but the primal fear of someone watching their entire world dissolve in real time. I called Harper repeatedly, demanding meetings, explanations, some kind of timeline for resolution. But her responses grew increasingly formal and less informative. The social invitations that had flooded my calendar for weeks suddenly dried up, not through any official announcement, but with the mysterious efficiency of gossip networks that somehow always know about financial trouble before the victims themselves fully understand their situations. People who'd sought my company at charity galas now avoided my calls, their assistants offering polite excuses about scheduling conflicts and prior commitments. I stood in my vast, half-renovated house, surrounded by luxury I could no longer afford to maintain, understanding for the first time that Arthur's quiet disappearance might have been something more strategic than simple displacement. What would you do if your own carefully constructed fortress suddenly became your prison, if the wealth you'd protected so ruthlessly turned out to be protecting itself from you? The contractors started showing up at my door, not with invoices but with ultimatums, their polite professionalism replaced by the sharp edge of people who'd been burned before. The master bathroom renovation, halfway completed, ground to a halt when the tile installer demanded payment up front for the remaining work. The landscape architect who'd been redesigning the pool area informed me that his company policy required settlement of outstanding balances before any additional services could be provided. I found myself making excuses. That felt foreign in my mouth. Explanations about temporary banking delays to people who'd never questioned my financial capacity before. The interior designer who'd been so eager to accommodate my vision now returned my calls with increasing reluctance, her assistant offering carefully worded responses about scheduling conflicts and prior commitments. My personal trainer canceled our sessions after his payment was declined, and the private chef who'd been preparing meals for my dinner parties sent a polite but firm message about needing to suspend services until accounts were current. Even my housekeeper, a woman who'd worked for Stella and me for 3 years, began asking uncomfortable questions about when she might expect her next paycheck. The humiliation cut deeper than the practical inconveniences. Each interaction a reminder that wealth wasn't just numbers in accounts, but the foundation of every relationship, every convenience, every assumption I'd built my adult life around. People who'd treated me with deference and respect for years now looked at me with the careful neutrality reserved for those whose financial stability had become questionable. I called Harper again, demanding a meeting, some kind of timeline, anything that might help me understand when this legal nightmare would resolve itself. Her response carried the measured tone of someone who'd delivered similar news too many times before. Professional sympathy wrapped around information she clearly wasn't authorized to share. She told me the review process was complex, involving multiple parties and legal precedents that made quick resolutions unlikely. There were questions about Arthur's displacement, about whether the terms of Stella's will had been properly honored, about fiduciary responsibilities that I'd apparently triggered through my actions. The Beverly Hills social circuit, meanwhile, had developed that peculiar kind of collective amnesia that wealthy communities deploy when one of their own faces financial difficulties. Invitations stopped arriving, phone calls went unreturned, and the charity boards that had welcomed my participation suddenly discovered conflicts with my involvement. I spent my evenings in the half-renovated house, surrounded by luxury I could no longer afford to complete, understanding for the first time how quickly respect disappears when the money behind it becomes uncertain. Arthur's phone number had been disconnected, but I managed to track down his new address through the property management company I'd used to set up his apartment. The place was a modest two-bedroom in a complex that wouldn't have registered on my radar 6 months earlier. The kind of development where middle-class retirees settle when their savings require careful management rather than confident spending. I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon, my Porsche looking absurdly out of place among the Honda Civics and Toyota Corollas parked in the visitors section. The building itself was clean but unremarkable, the kind of place where people live quietly, without the dramatic flourishes that money allows or demands. When Arthur opened the door, he looked older than I remembered, the weight loss more pronounced, the lines around his eyes deeper. He didn't seem surprised to see me, though his expression carried none of the warmth that had characterized our relationship when Stella was alive, when I'd been the successful son-in-law he'd spoken about with obvious pride. He invited me inside with the careful politeness of someone who understood exactly why I was there, offering coffee that I declined while taking note of the small, tidy space that contained nothing from the life he'd shared with us in Beverly Hills. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that connected him to Stella or the mansion that had been his home for the final years of his life. I asked him directly about the will, about any conversations he might have had with lawyers or estate planners, about anything that could explain the legal complications that had frozen my inheritance. His response came with the measured calm of someone who'd been expecting these questions for weeks, who'd had time to prepare answers that revealed nothing while acknowledging everything. He told me that Stella had been very specific about her wishes regarding family legacy, that she'd worked with Harper for months to ensure every detail of the will reflected her values about responsibility and care for those she loved. He mentioned provisions I'd never heard discussed, conditions that had seemed like legal formalities when Harper first read the document, but now carried weight I was only beginning to understand. The conversation lasted less than 30 minutes, but Arthur's carefully chosen words painted a picture that made my stomach drop. Stella hadn't just left me an inheritance. She'd created a test, a way to measure whether I deserved the empire she'd built or whether I'd proven myself unworthy through my treatment of the people she'd considered family. I left his apartment understanding that the old man I'd dismissed so easily might hold the key to everything I thought I'd secured. The revelation hit me 3 days later when Harper finally agreed to meet me at her office, armed with documents that laid out the full scope of what Stella had actually written into her will. The conference room felt smaller this time, the city view through those floor-to-ceiling windows somehow less commanding when viewed by someone whose financial foundation was crumbling beneath him. Harper spread the papers across the mahogany table, with the methodical precision of someone delivering a diagnosis, each page representing another layer of complexity I'd never bothered to understand when the money had been flowing freely. The legal language was dense, deliberately obscure, but the practical implications became crystal clear as she walked me through each provision. Stella had included what Harper called a family care clause, a mechanism designed to ensure that anyone she considered family would be treated with dignity and respect by whoever inherited her estate. Arthur's sudden displacement from the house had triggered a review process that wouldn't just examine my legal right to the inheritance, but my moral fitness to carry on her legacy. There were other conditions I'd never paid attention to during the initial reading. Requirements about maintaining charitable commitments, about preserving the foundation she'd established, about ensuring that the wealth she'd accumulated would continue serving the community values she'd held dear. My focus on claiming everything quickly had blinded me to the responsibilities that came with the privilege. But what stunned me most was the discovery that Arthur hadn't been a passive victim in this situation. He'd been in contact with Harper from the beginning, not to contest the will or claim any portion of the inheritance, but to ensure that Stella's true wishes were being honored. The old man I'd viewed as a sentimental obstacle to my plans had actually been protecting the woman he'd raised from a son-in-law who saw her empire as nothing more than assets to be seized. The truth was, I hadn't inherited control of anything. Stella had been testing whether I deserved it, and by treating Arthur like a burden to be discarded, by viewing her charitable commitments as expenses to be eliminated, by rushing to transform her carefully built legacy into my personal playground, I'd failed the test before I'd even realized I was taking it. The money, the house, the social position, all of it had been conditional on proving I understood what she'd actually valued, and I'd demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that I didn't understand at all. The next few weeks passed in a haze of legal meetings, uncomfortable phone calls, and the gradual dismantling of the life I'd thought I'd secured. Harper explained that the estate review process would likely take months, possibly longer if additional complications arose, which seemed increasingly probable as each day brought new evidence of how thoroughly I'd misunderstood Stella's intentions. My liquid assets, the money I'd counted on to maintain my lifestyle during what I'd assumed would be a brief adjustment period, dwindled faster than I'd imagined possible. The mortgage payments on the mansion continued, relentless and enormous, while my ability to generate income remained effectively frozen along with my access to Stella's accounts. The Beverly Hills house, which had felt like a symbol of my success just months earlier, began to feel like an elaborate trap, its 12,000 square feet requiring maintenance, utilities, and services that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. Every room I walked through reminded me of renovations I could no longer afford to complete, of dinner parties I could no longer host, of a social position that evaporated along with my financial credibility. I started making desperate calculations, looking into loans against property I might not actually own, exploring credit lines that required collateral I couldn't access. The math became increasingly grim as I realized how completely my entire lifestyle had depended on Stella's wealth, how little I'd actually built or earned independently during our years together, friends who'd seemed eager to maintain our relationships when I'd been the wealthy widower with interesting investment opportunities began finding excuses to avoid my calls. The charity boards that had welcomed my participation suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts whenever I tried to arrange meetings. Even my golf club membership, paid automatically for years, faced cancellation when the bank declined the annual fee. But the cruelest irony was watching Arthur from a distance, learning through mutual acquaintances that the old man had quietly begun volunteering with local community organizations, using his veterinary background to help animal shelters and rescue groups that couldn't afford professional services. While I was trapped in a mansion I could no longer maintain, he'd found ways to continue contributing to the world around him. He'd understood something about Stella's values that I'd completely missed, something about service and responsibility that went far beyond accumulating assets or maintaining social status. And my failure to grasp those values hadn't just cost me the inheritance, it had revealed who I really was beneath the confident exterior I'd built around her money. The woman who'd trusted me with her legacy had discovered, too late, that I'd never actually understood what made that legacy worth protecting. 6 months later, I'm writing this from a 2-bedroom condo in Burbank, the same kind of middle-class housing I'd looked down on when visiting Arthur, the same practical anonymity that used to represent everything I thought I'd risen above. The Porsche is gone, sold to pay legal fees that mounted faster than my understanding of how completely I'd destroyed my own future. The estate review concluded exactly as Arthur had probably known it would from the moment I'd asked him to leave. Stella's will contained enough conditions, enough requirements about family care and community responsibility, enough tests of character that my actions during those first crucial weeks provided all the evidence needed to demonstrate my unworthiness as her heir. The house went to a charitable foundation she'd established, the money allocated to causes she'd supported for years, the social position I'd tried so desperately to claim redistributed to people who actually understood what service meant. I received a small settlement, enough to start over if I was careful, enough to survive if I learned to live differently. Arthur never spoke to me again, which I understood completely. I'd shown him exactly who I was when I thought I had the power to treat him however I chose. And that revelation couldn't be undone by regret or apologies or desperate attempts to repair damage that went far beyond hurt feelings. Final irony is that I'm probably a better person now than I was when I had everything. Losing Stella's fortune forced me to discover skills I'd never needed to develop. Relationships based on something other than financial advantage, satisfaction that came from work rather than inheritance. But that growth came at a price that still makes me sick to think about. Here I am, confessing to someone I'll never meet about losing $75 million because I failed a test I didn't know I was taking. Subscribe if you've ever inherited something valuable and wondered whether you'd handle it better than I did. Hit that notification bell because stories about learning what family actually means don't come with instruction manuals, and honestly, this keeps me up at night. If your spouse left you everything but secretly designed it as a character test, would you have passed? Would you have treated their father with the dignity I should have shown Arthur? Or would you have made the same catastrophic mistake that cost me everything I thought I wanted? The man who thought he'd won everything became the man who lost what mattered most. And the question I'll let you wrestle with tonight. Maybe that was always the real test.